Hey guys, so my name is David Donis, and I did my presentation on disaster management in Armenia. So just going into the history and reasoning behind Armenia's disaster management system. So Armenia's disaster management system has been largely shaped by severe earthquakes of its past, since that's the disaster the country is most often affected by. Specifically, the country's disaster management system has been largely shaped by the 1988 Spitak earthquake, which led to the death of roughly 25,000 people, although the estimates tend to vary, but 25,000 tends to be the average. The earthquake and other earthquakes of this severity highlighted the country's poor building standards and lack of standardized disaster management that existed at the time. At the time that this earthquake struck in particular, Armenia was still a part of the Soviet Union, which is something to note. So after the dissolution of the Soviet Union is when Armenia began to develop its own disaster management system, which became known as the Ministry of Emergency Situations. So in regards to the implementation and who participated, so the disaster management system in Armenia can be best described as a centralized approach, meaning that the government basically regulates and controls most of the larger facets of the disaster management within the country. So as I stated here, Ministry of Emergency Situations oversees most of the country's governmental disaster management approaches, so it's kind of a top-down approach. So even with this in mind, non-governmental organizations or NGOs also have played a pretty significant role in the country's disaster management system. So one to note is the Armenian Red Cross, which does a lot of work specifically with education and volunteer work within the country. So even though the system was eventually implemented, there are still, of course, obstacles to effective disaster management. So because the system is still relatively new, there are issues in implementation. Significantly would be the limited infrastructure, because it's a relatively new system since the Soviet Union became disillusioned in the early 1990s, so it's a relatively new system. Also, coordinating between governmental and non-governmental organizations can at times be tricky, especially during severe disasters, which Armenia tends to be faced with really severe earthquakes that happen about once every decade or so on average. And because the earthquakes tend to be pretty severe, the country does rely somewhat heavily on international aid from the EU and even the United States, so something to keep in mind. So how disasters shaped policy and planning. So as I mentioned earlier, the 1988 Spitak earthquake was probably the biggest causation, I guess you could say, for implementation of new building codes and standards, meaning before that earthquake, the building codes, or if there were any at all, were pretty poor, which is one of the reasons that the earthquake was considered to be so severe, is because many buildings and large structures just crumbled relatively easily. And it was this earthquake in particular that heavily influenced the creation of the Ministry of Emergency Situations, and it also led to stronger relationships with non-governmental organizations and international organizations. And now when I say international organizations, within the case of Armenia, they tend to somewhat rely on the European Union for emergency aid, specifically when large earthquakes like this show up. And then these are just my sources, so yeah.